discuss together about, I guess, alternative methods to how to approach economics, or better political economy, and how to revive political economy. So we are in a moment in which the capital order, which came out in November, is extremely timely because austerity is back with a vengeance. We are seeing interest rate hikes all over the world, central banks hawkishly rising interest rates combined with austerity budgets. Of course, also here in South Africa, we know that expenditures on health, education, and other social benefits are going down, while the money used to service the debt is actually increasing. So with threats to privatize, I think also now your electricity sector, and of course deregulate wages, deregulate labor and suppress wages. So the whole austerity package that we will discuss in a minute. So the reason why I wrote this book was that I was very dissatisfied with the type of debate that was going on within economics about austerity. Why? Well, because it was all about whether austerity was capable or not of boosting economic growth and delivering in ultimately balancing the budget. So if you read a little bit about austerity, both the critics and the advocates for austerity are looking at the multiplier and discussing issues that ultimately look at austerity as a technical tool to manage the economy. Now, I think this type of debate is highly problematic, also from a historical point of view, because it does not help answer the question, why is austerity so persistent in shaping our society for such a long time? And this is why, because ultimately, if you're a critic of austerity, if you remain in this technical vision, then the only thing you can really say is, well, it's bad theory, which leads to bad policy. And ultimately, if politicians apply it, it must be that either they're corrupt, or they're stupid, or they're advised by bad economists. And this, I don't think, is a very interesting way of trying to explain what happens historically. Mark Blyth talks about this pattern of constant repetition as madness, and the purpose of the book is saying, no, there actually is method in this madness. If you take a different perspective on austerity and you look at austerity as a political project that is fundamental in safeguarding what is the foundation of our current society, which is capital as a social relation. So this is where we need to revive political economy as the discipline that is capable of understanding how our economic system is not made up of facts separate from us, right? That we can just count and run regressions on. But it's actually the outcome of a collective decision-making process, And we need to focus on the fact that economic growth is not economic growth in general, it's capitalist economic growth, which presupposes this basic social relation by which the majority is willing to sell their capacity to work in return for a wage. So this wage, capital as a social relation, is what is most fundamental for capital as well as commodities, right? And this is, of course, is not my intuition, it is the intuition coming from classical political economy, from Smith, Ricardo, all the way to Marx. And it is in this sense that we can understand austerity as a fundamental buffer to capitalism, what is fundamental to protect capital as a social relation, which is not natural, is not a given, it has not been eternal in how humans have understood the way to organize society, but is actually a very young economic system. It's only 0.1% of the time Homo sapiens has been on the planet that we've been under capitalism. And people tend to forget this because austerity has been so successful in giving us a sense that there is no alternative. This is the only game in town, and there's never will be another way to run our society. So it is in this sense that we understand how austerity is intelligent and successful and wielded as a one-sided class warfare against the people. And what austerity is this trinity, how I conceptualize it is a trinity of policies. So it's not enough to define austerity as it usually is, if you look at economic debates, which is the standard definition is austerity is about cuts in the budget and hikes in taxes, right? Increase in taxes. So this is the typical framework of economics today, which is looking at the aggregate. Well, guess what? The aggregate doesn't tell you anything about how resources are actually shifted in society and who are the winners and who are the losers of our economic system and of austerity policies. So this is why in the conceptualization of austerity as a trinity of fiscal, monetary, industrial policies, it is interesting to see, if we look at fiscal austerity, for example, where the state spends. The fact that in South Africa today, more than 300 billion are spent on debt servicing, and money is spent on the military. If you look at the aggregate, then you don't see austerity because actually the state is spending a lot. But the point is that the state is spending, giving money to the creditors and taking away resources from the people. And this is not done by accident, but it's done because ultimately this does boost the precariousness and the market dependence of the majority who make a living off of wages. And this is crucial to preserve the capital order because the more you make people precarious and market dependent, the more the people will ultimately accept their condition as exploited labor. So this is fiscal austerity combined with regressive taxation. Again, it's not about tax hikes in general. It's about increasing taxes on the people, which are consumption taxes. No, the VAT in this country went up. Now it's 15%. While you constantly cut taxes at the top, right? We know that corporate taxes, real wealth is really not taxed almost at all. Inherited taxes are gone. This type of just not taxing, of course, the moneyed few and taxing the bottom. Which, of course, if you think about it, if the real reason for austerity were the balancing the budget, then this would make no sense. Because if you really want to get money, you get it from the people who have money, right? You tax corporations and you would get money. But this is so it's clear that that's not the objective. The objective is actually to subdue the people and incentivize those who the economic models that lead our society tell us are the engine of the economic machine, which are, of course, the safer investors. This is why we constantly need to attract investors. And of course, this is why we need to stop taxing capital, because otherwise, of course, capital leaves. And this is not a lie. This is capitalism. It's true. It's a limit of what the state can do because capital does leave the country. This is fiscal austerity. Monetary austerity is about any increases in interest rates, which of course have the result of not only making it harder for people to get to the end of the month, especially in South Africa. I would understand that many citizens are actually highly indebted, but it's also the case that it increases unemployment. And this is exactly what the Fed is telling us today should be happening, is that interest rates are going up because the labor market right now is too hot, meaning that there's too many jobs and too few people willing to accept the job. And this is no good for economists because actually we need to make sure that people are willing to accept lower wages. And so now the Fed is explicitly saying we need to increase the unemployment rate so that we can keep wages lower because now nominal wages are going up in the United States at least. So once more, shifting of resources from the creditor. If you have money, now it's a good time to invest in treasury bonds while the people lose their jobs. And then we have industrial austerity, which is, of course, about privatizing, deregulating labor, and repressing wages. So this trinity emerges is something that right now, and this I think is important because we want to keep the discussion on method, is the fact that right now we have quite normalized austerity. Austerity is now synonymous with realistic, prudent in economics, right? So it's kind of synonymous with economics, austerity. That's why it's ultimately undetectable. It's what just any economist would tell you is the recipe to move forward. So this is why it's important to take history seriously and to recover the importance of historical political economy, because it is when you there are certain historical moments that allow, I think, people to recognize things that are slightly less visible today. And this is why the book takes place after the First World War. Actually, it begins with the First World War and shows how austerity becomes visible. Because the thesis of the book is that austerity is in the DNA of capitalism. It's kind of clear from what I said so far, is that austerity is actually the DNA of capitalism. If you have capitalism, in a way, you've got to have austerity. And we can discuss more about this later. But the point is that it becomes visible in a moment in which capitalism is highly contested. In a moment in which capitalism confronts the greatest existential crisis of its history, which is what happens in 1919, 1920. And I focus on Western Europe because I like to focus on actually what was at the time the center, the core of advanced capitalism at that moment. And what you see is that contemporaries were really feeling that the system was not going to last for more than a couple of years. And the first part of the book is all dedicated to a reconstruction of why this crisis, so the massive shock of state intervention in the economy during the First World War, that repoliticized the pillars of capitalism, so private property of the means of production and wage relations were all of a sudden understood as being about political choices and not anymore just, the outcome of impersonal market forces. And this really triggered a lot of movements from the more reformist to more radical for a different society, a different post-capitalist society. And my work is done in the archives and through newspapers of the time in order to really kind of give voice to this spirit of the time, which was really one in which the bourgeoisie itself was like kind of, Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, head of the government at that time, was clearly saying there's no way we can go back to how things were. Let me see if I can find the citation just to give you a sense of the words that were being used. Sorry, I should have. Here it is. The opening speech of incumbent Prime Minister Lloyd George at the November 1918 coalition election campaign was eloquent. We cannot return to the old conditions. War is like a plowshare and a harrow. It has turned up and rent the soil of Europe. We cannot go back. And this is just one of the many, many statements. And these were not just abstract ideas, but what I show is that it was actually put into practice through different experiments from the Guild Socialist movement in Britain, which was very successful actually in 1919, 1920 in rebuilding housing for the people, to the worker council movement, which I think is the most interesting example of how actually there was a methodological vision. So the idea was that you needed to debunk both bourgeois institutions and bourgeois methodology in order to have a vision of how knowledge came directly from action and not from above. So how knowledge was alive if it came through the organization of the councils. And I looked specifically at the case, of course, of the Italian movement with Antonio Gramsci and L'Ordine Nuovo, which are an enormous source of inspiration, I think still today, to understand what are some possibilities of alternatives way of also understanding the construction of knowledge for universities. But even in Britain, not in Italy, even in Britain, we had this whole movement for adult education, which was really about giving the possibility for people to self-educate and learn collectively, which was really quite fascinating. So the first part of the book, I think, stands on its own terms in the sense that it can give a lot of inspiration for current struggles. And I also would like to take on a point that you made earlier, which is the effort here was to not reconstruct this moment with the benefit of hindsight, with the idea that we know that this period failed in the sense that it was a parenthesis. It didn't last long as an opening of possibilities. But this does not mean that we shouldn't take it seriously and really use the lens of people living in that moment. No? And I think this is a problem historians face, is that a lot of time history is reconstructed too much with the benefit of insight. So you do not give enough attention to what was really the spirit of the time. So this is the effort, is to actually be real, because it's all primary sources, but I did, of course, read all the secondary literature, and there's such little literature, and all the literature is extremely dismissive, because everyone is interested in showing, it didn't work. But let's try. So that's the first thing of the method of this first part. And then the reason why this first part exists was to actually show how austerity emerges as a direct counteroffensive to this state of affairs. And in this moment, the people in power got worried, got frightened, and they organized quickly, swiftly, and intelligently. They put together the first international financial conferences ever were done in Brussels in 1920 and in Genoa in 1922, in which for the first time, experts, economists, academics were brought to this conference to advise governments. And of course, no labor representative was invited. The idea was, no, we need to make this conference about technical expertise, objectivity, neutrality. Let's separate the economic from the political, and let's talk economics. So this is where the second part of the book studies austerity as this double strategy of coercion and consensus, by which, of course, by implementing austerity, you silence the working class. And this is shown also through historical data that looks at how, from the minute austerity was imposed, a couple of years later, unemployment surges, strikes basically end. It was a moment of enormous strikes, never strikes like this, but how this really is a moment in which the working class offensive is successfully stalled off. And here are the words of G.D.H. Cole, who was a very important guild socialist and public intellectual. He wrote a lot in those years. Very interesting stuff he wrote. And just to give you a sense of the success of austerity. The big working class offensive has been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So here, I think Cole is very sharp in understanding that austerity, of course, has a short-term cost, which is a recession, something that the IMF right now is predicting. They know that interest rate hikes are going to cause a recession. But there's a longer-term structural gain, which is the fact that you are making sure that the capital order, is fully stabilized. So you destabilize the economy, but you're ultimately stabilizing class relations, and this is what matters. So the book looks at these international financial conferences, the formation of this financial code, which was then implemented throughout Europe. And I focus on a comparative historical analysis between Italy and Britain. And I will tell you more about this in a second. How am I doing with time? I just want to say two more things. Okay, good. So Italy and Britain, there's so many. So I would like to read you some more quotes to give you a sense of the type of wording that was that came out of Brussels in general, because it's very interesting also for us at the present. Just last thing I want to say about Brussels is that one other intuition, methodological intuitions from this book that I think is important, is how economic problems are always also political problems. And this is something that I think economists have lost sight of. It's the fact that it doesn't make sense to discuss economic problems as separate from political problems. This is actually the outcome of years of austerity, both in terms of austerity theory and austerity policies. Because actually, it was clear at the time that inflation, for example, was a deeply political issue. And it still is today, right? So this is Keynes, who was one of the terrified people in 1919. He was a big advocate for austerity in the early moments when it mattered. Then he turned critical when the working classes had already been defeated. But Keynes said, but the economists who at the time advocated for harsh, dear money, used words that are by now famous. A continuance of inflationism and high prices will not only depress the exchanges, but their effect on prices will strike at the whole basis of contract, of security, and of the capitalist system generally. In a similar vein, the Italian economist Luigi Einaudi wrote, "What appeared to profoundly shake the entire society and prepare a social revolution was called with a technical word monetary inflation." So at the time, these economists were very well aware how their role was in being political and how economic problems needed to be understood in a political sense. Yet what is fascinating to me is to realize how much they also understood the power of technocracy. So this book is about how economics emerges, the current paradigm that we study, right? The neoclassical framework that then we know has different strands and complexities. But the point is that it emerges in a moment in which economists were deeply embedded in class struggle. But they understood that the most politically powerful weapon was to deny the political basis of theory, right? So the urge to declare themselves as apolitical was understood as something that was fundamental in order to convince people that they were just badly educated. They did not understand what was really happening. They could not demand for a better future because there was an economic necessity that needed to be imposed. So this is why the book looks at the protagonists of the story are famous economists operating in Britain and in Italy. And what you see is, of course, and this is, again, I think an important point of method, is like in Britain, I look at, especially at Ralph Hawtrey. Ralph Hawtrey was the in-house economist of the British Treasury. And it's interesting because it's that at that moment that the British Treasury realizes that it's not enough for them to just do austerity that as they had done prior to the war. Now they needed sophisticated economic theory to back what they were doing. And this is Hawtrey, who is one of the founding fathers of macroeconomics, actually, who has been a great influence on the Chicago School of Economics in the years to follow, comes up with this ultimately overconsumptionist model of inflation. And he used extremely technical terms, and I spent a year reading Hawtrey, and my life was very miserable because he's a very difficult scholar, and especially very prolific. So he wrote a lot of published academic work, but especially he wrote a lot of memos for the Treasury. So he was directly advising the controllers of finance, were the people who were writing the memos for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it's very interesting to trace the profound influence of Hawtrey's theory on these controllers, who then were influencing the Chancellor. And Hawtrey's theory was also read a lot by Montagu Norman and the Bank of England at the time. And what you see is that he comes up with this overconsumptionist model by which he says, he models the economy as a great credit machine. So immediately you see how he expels class analysis completely. Instead of having workers and capitalists, he has consumers who all appear all of a sudden to be individuals, right? So you eliminate classes and conflict, and all of a sudden you have these individuals as consumers. But guess what? As these individuals, there are those who are more virtuous and those who are less virtuous. And there's the unproductive consumer, who are clearly the workers because they don't have money to invest. He says it, like workers don't have bank accounts, so they can't invest, they can't. So they're unproductive consumption. And then there is productive consumption. And of course, we're in a moment in which Say's law is still holding, which is what the Keynes will rebuke, which is the idea that anything that is saved is also invested. And so these productive consumers were those who ultimately were to be incentivized. And given that there is an inflationary threat, the market economy is unstable, what you need to do is manage the behavior of people so that the majority is forced to abstain and the minority can actually invest. So consume less, produce more, which is the motto coined at Brussels and Genoa, is actually made technical in the theory of Ralph Hawtrey. But this moralism is very obvious if you look at what the controllers are actually saying, right? So the controllers are like more explicitly showcasing the classist bias that Hawtrey is so good at disguising in his models. So this is Ralph Hawtrey, and I think this is very important because actually the whole understanding of Keynes of effective demand, right? Keynes is very important because effective demand was introduced by Ralph Hawtrey. And not in the way we understand effective demand if we think about Keynes, which is actually that he understands that we should boost effective demand in moments of downturn. The problem in the 1919 was the opposite. It's a similar problem that we're facing right now in the United States. What does the Fed say? People are consuming too much. Wages are going up. There's a wage push, and this is the cause of inflation, right? The cause of inflation is ultimately because the people are earning and spending too much. This is still what the Fed models are telling us now. And this was exactly what Hawtrey was telling us. So effective demand was really the idea that monetary policy can only be successful if it effectively manages people's behavior. So the connection between macroeconomic management and the real life of people, and especially industrial relations, was very obvious to the founding fathers of the framework. And now it's still obvious, but there's layers of models, there's layers of numbers. He wrote rather than have a lot of mathematics. And I think this makes it more visible how really macroeconomic management was all about taming the citizens into accepting what is ultimately, in fact, what capitalism requires in order for economic growth to even happen in this society, right? So this is the British case. And then the Italian case is also very fascinating because in Italy, we had more of a classic pure economics framework. So the founding fathers of marginalism, if you think about Valraj, Evans, in Italy, we had Mattei Pantaleoni, who was one of the big names. And one important methodological approach I used, and this was pissed off a lot of my colleagues in the history of economic thought, very upset. Because what I tended to do was, okay, I read the theoretical work, and especially someone like Mattei Pantaleoni wrote the Principles of Pure Economics. And it's all syllogisms coming out of the Homo economicus postulate. No, we all resemble a Homo economicus. We're all, again, individuals, we expel classes, there's all harmony, if only we all efficiently maximize. And then this pure science in which then everything else follows in a very harmonic, elegant, aesthetically beautiful way. So this is Mattei Pantaleoni's high theory. But then what I did was look at what Mattei Pantaleoni was doing in his life as a scholar, and what he was doing was writing a lot of public newspapers because he was actually quite engaged in current affairs. And the words he used in his public speeches, thanks to Bolshevism, the modesty and the standard of living that characterize Italians has vanished. It has disappeared in both the working class and the peasantry. It is disgusting to witness the masses of workers that are drunk in all our cities. The notable increase of wages was not accompanied by greater civilization, so that the worker and his spouse live like pigs in their homes in order to waste the greatest part of their income in wine at the tavern. This is Mattei Pantaleoni, who in his actual life was a fascist supporter of Mussolini and worked for Mussolini in Mussolini's cabinet. But you look at liberal Einaudi. So Einaudi, our great president of the Republic after the downfall of Mussolini, and recycled himself as an anti-fascist. He was of the same exact opinion in those years. He wrote, "It is well known that the wages of workers in industrial and commercial areas of Italy have increased noticeably," which, by the way, is not true if you look at the data. It's okay. The evidence being the conspicuous increase in unnecessary consumption of alcoholic drinks, of sweets, chocolate, and biscuits. So this is basically the bourgeoisie telling people, what are you doing? You're eating way too many biscuits. So this is for me important, is that this political activism of these scholars is not an extra to the theory. So this, I think, is the contribution, my contribution to the history of thought and historical political economy in general, is that we cannot separate the theory from the moments of its creation. And so it's not, the problem is that history of thought is not even taught in universities anymore in the economics department. And the idea is, well, it's really irrelevant. If you want to know more and you're curious and you want some nice bios of people, you can go and read something. I'm lucky enough to teach at the New School, where history of thought is actually mandatory for students. And what I try to do is that, there's different ways in which you can teach history of thought. There's also the way in which, again, you separate the theory from the lives and the political engagement. What I instead try to show is actually how you cannot understand the theory itself without understanding this, what is usually considered extra, but actually the political engagement, the context in which these theories emerges are constitutive of the theory itself. And I think this is really important also for economists when they read economics journals today and the type of models that are being produced. So this is what is done for the Italian case. Now I cannot get into the details, but there's all this analysis of, pushing away from the labor theory of value, which until then was still dominant in Italy as well, right? You expel the worker as the source of value, and you instead want to give life to the theory of abstinence, right? So there's all these treaties being written, and it's like, no, there's no theory of value. Really what matters is utility theory, and ultimately abstinence is really what matters. So who is the engine of the economic machine is no longer the worker and exploitation, but is the saver investor, the virtuous man who has a lower subjective discount rate, so who suffers less if he has to wait, Mathematically, one of these guys also like Mattei is the subjective discount rate, to show that ultimately those at the top are there because they are ultimately benefiting the rest of society, right? The harmonic model, we've dropped conflict in our models. It's all harmony, and there's these saver investors who ultimately should be incentivized, and this is what austerity is there to do, to shift resources to those who deserve it, because ultimately they are doing the good of the whole. So we see here how austerity is not just policy, this trinity, it's also the theory backing this policy and how the two go together and were created in a moment that is very visible of what they were meant to do. And this is why I also show statistically with numbers the successes of austerity in safeguarding the capital order. If I have one more minute, I would just like to say that one other important contribution, I think, methodologically, is that the comparison between the Italian and the British case also helps, and this is a more of a political contribution perhaps, also helps a little bit rethink certain comforting binaries that we still are attached to right now, which are the fact, for example, that fascism and liberalism are so distant as ideologies and institutions. But if you take the lens of austerity, what you see is that actually fascism and liberalism are quite close-knit when it comes to defending the capital order. There is a priority, which is making sure the working class is subdued, then all else matters. And so chapter 8 is one of the chapters I'm most proud of, because there was nothing of secondary literature really on this. So I went in the archives at the Bank of England, but also at the Kew Garden Archives has the whole part of the Foreign Office in which you can find all the files of the British Embassy in Italy. And you see how the support of the international liberal elite for Mussolini in the 1920s was quite impressive in just the very vocal support, because they were saying Mussolini has made it. He has imposed industrial peace. There's no more strikes. The profit rates are going up again. The wage share is going down again. This is all great. And this is Montagu Norman, who was, an embodiment of liberalism. And he was saying, even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated, and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, this state of affairs is suitable at present, and many people for the moment, the state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued. Fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. So, of course, this is now no exception. We know in the history of the 20th century, this has happened again with the Pinochet case, with Boris Yeltsin and Larry Summers being very supportive of the fact that Yeltsin, bombed his own parliament, but he was then able to privatize, liberalize, and open up the markets. And so ultimately, last chapter, Austerity Forever, shows how the themes that this case study highlights are constantly reemerged throughout the history of our society. And so I think, and the point here is not to get depressed. The point here is actually to realize, and I would like to just conclude with the final words of the book, which is austerity is a political project arising. The book has detailed a set of influential economic patterns that are pervasive across the globe and that shape our daily lives. Contrary to what the proponents of austerity would have us think, however, the socioeconomic system we live in is not inevitable, nor is it to be gradually accepted as the only way forward. Austerity is a political project arising out of the need to preserve capitalist class relations of domination. It is the outcome of collective action to foreclose any alternatives to capitalism. It can thus be subverted through collective counteraction. The study of its logic and purpose is a first step in that direction. So this is kind of, my contribution here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Clara. That was very insightful and really interesting. Now I open the floor for comments or questions from the audience. If you want, please introduce yourself and bring your question or comment.
My name is David Canning. I'm visiting from Harvard. So I would say, I think I've got an agreement and disagreement. My agreement is, I work on aging. And one of the really bizarre things in aging is you've got all these papers saying, what do we have to do to save Social Security? And there is a Social Security budget constraint. But satisfying that budget constraint is not the aim of society. The aim of society should be to make human welfare better. And making the budget constraint the goal is a really bizarre thing for people to do. But all the papers are written that way. The population aging makes Social Security unsustainable. And the answer, therefore, is to change the institution. But instead, the goal seems to be in the literature, how can we sustain the institutions and change people in order to achieve that? And that's a really bizarre way of thinking, but it's incredibly common. And so the institutional sustaining becomes the goal. I think that's really what you're getting at, that the goal of these policies is to make institutions survive, not to improve welfare. And we're not ready enough to give up on institutions. I don't think Social Security is or should be the goal, but that mindset is very crazy. Then I think in terms of this, I think in a historical perspective, it's really interesting. But I think I will go back a bit further. I think the more interesting case is the end of feudalism. So feudalism was based on a land tenure system. And it broke down essentially because land became unimportant in the production process. And the value of land in GDP now in most countries is about 2-3%. It really doesn't matter. And the feudal system became incompatible with modern methods of production, which didn't make sense. It's Marxist analysis of why feudalism did. There's a lot of interesting work, a lot of interesting historical things about how to preserve feudalism. People were very keen on preserving feudalism.
Right.
And the old Spawn laws in Britain were the fact that we keep the income of the landed gentry on. And it all failed. The interesting thing is that capitalism preserving capitalism is succeeding, but the failure of feudalism to survive is maybe an interesting case. But it was really incompatible with the production system. But there were very strong efforts. The whole divine right of kings, in a sense, is about the survival of feudalism. I think the interesting thing today is that capitalism is coming to an end. Its end is in sight. And the reason you can see that is, for 20 years, the real rate of interest has been negative. Even today, with our interest rates, the real interest rates are still negative. There is abundant capital. There's no capital slowly in the world. Capital is not terribly valuable. So the system is going to break down. The thing that is valuable today is knowledge. So the companies are valuable, and the key resource in the world is knowledge and ideas. I think looking to that, the really bizarre thing is that knowledge is the public good, but we have patents and copyright law and trade secrets which make knowledge a private good. And that it's that knowledge which is going to be key, is key now, and is going to be even more key in the future. So now if you attack capitalism, I think you won't get much pushback. But if you were to attack patent rights and copyright law, you will get enormous pushback, because that's where the real political interest lies. The people. So I think the capitalism era is actually coming to an end. But it's not coming to an end from a Marxist perspective because of labor, because knowledge is not key. And that's where the political power lies. So I think you're in this middle ground. And I think looking back to this, the longer history towards liberalism and the sort of future towards knowledge-based, give a broader perspective.
Thank you very much. There's many things to be said here. Very, very interesting thoughts. The position of this book is that for capitalism doesn't really come to an end on its own, in the sense that it depends how we define capitalism, right? The work of Robert Brenner, I think, is very important for me, is persuasive in indicating like how the transformation from feudalism to capitalism was about kind of the emergence of market dependence as a peculiar feature of our society, and this market dependence binding both workers and capitalists, of course. But I do think that the idea here is this market dependence being ultimately a social relation, that in order to actually have capitalism falling, then is this the wage relation that is something that would need to be abolished. So I wonder whether that is so. I don't think that is something that could happen without forms of political struggle. That's why I think, like, again, we need to consider the economic and the political as something that should not be separate. But it's very difficult conceptually for us, I think, because we are used to kind of treating even how we divide it back within the department. There's economics, there's politics. They never speak to each other. I mean, it's so in this sense, your analysis is very interesting. I wonder what this would mean in terms of what happens to wage relations if we agree that that's a critical defining feature of capitalism, and how the wage relations can be overcome with. I do think it requires forms of agency of collective struggle, and I do think that we are in a moment, I agree, in which there's also an ideological breakdown. And this is why also inflation is fomenting forms of upheaval to the most spontaneous right now. You know, in the United States right now, people are just resigning from their jobs, right? So in the United States right now, it's very interesting because there's a unionization drive, which is new, especially in the service sector, which is something that usually had not been seen. But there's also these spontaneous rebellions towards the wage relations, in the sense that of the Great Resignation that now has hit 46 million people have left their job in 2022. In 2021, it was a similar number. I think it was 42 million. It's serious, and this is why actually while like 10 years ago they were let's see this statistic wrong, so I'm not going to say it because I always forget it. But anyway, the point is that there were 10 years ago, there were much more like unemployed people with respect to job openings. Now we're in a moment in which is the opposite. There's more job openings than people willing to take on the job, right? So this is the capital disorder in a way that the Fed is trying to cure, that it's problematic. So I wonder whether, like, this is the idea that you need to preserve this social relation, and anything goes, even the fact that they are inducing a recession right now and they kind of know it. But there are priorities, let's say. But yeah, it would be super cool to think about this in much longer term perspective. But I already get criticized because this is already longer term perspective than usual, because usually people associate austerity with the neoliberal term. Well, the idea here is no, let's stop using the word neoliberalism too much, because I think it again diverts the attention to what is more interesting, which are these kind of the limits of capitalism as such, and neoliberalism tends to give a sense, oh, then there is this other thing outside of neoliberalism that is feasible and okay. Well, I don't think it's, I think there's a lot of idealization of a non-neoliberal moment. So the idea is actually to try to go back to show how there's more continuities. Thank you.
But let me just say on that point, I mean, I think the population aging is quite important.
Absolutely.
Because it is leading to capital surplus and labor shortage.
Absolutely. And that's really important. That's extremely important. I agree with you.
Do we have a question here?
Hi, I'm Nikki Netris. I actually teach history of economic thought here. I still teach. But when I haven't read your book, I'm looking forward to it, so forgive me if I'm getting this a bit wrong. But when you talk about the relationship between economic ideas and the rise of fascism, the obvious thought comes to mind is how do you relate to Polanyi's Great Transformation? Because he argues that it was in projecting this notion of an impossible utopia. Bad idea, in other words. We forgot as economists that we were going to disembed people from society, upset them all, and they'll vote fascists or accept fascists. That was in the argument.
Yeah.
Are you saying something like that, except with another spin, which is they didn't just invent a bad idea, they were doing it with a deliberate, malicious, class-like aligned intent, and that in fact they wanted Mussolini. I mean, I wasn't quite
Right. So yeah. So that's the thing that so usually the story goes, yeah, the story is that in a way fascism is a rebellion against austerity or free market policies. Here I'm actually trying to show a different story that emerges if you look at Italian fascism in its birth moment. And what you see is actually that it was quite the opposite in the sense that Mussolini came to power promising the suppression of working class upheaval. So you know what I mean? So it's actually very different. It was a revolutionary moment in which people were demanding a breakaway from capitalism from the left through the idea of self-governance of production fundamentally. So really breaking away also from the capitalist state altogether.
So do you think Polanyi is wrong?
Well, I think Polanyi is potentially looking at like the case of Germany and is making more of a general case, but I do think that it has kind of influenced how we look at also that. But if we look at actually the grounding moment of fascism, which is it, I mean, fascism is coined by Benito Mussolini as il movimento dei fasci, okay? And so basically, if you look at this moment, what you see is actually that he was called by the king in perfect institutional continuity to resolve the political crisis. He got the coalition votes of the liberals and the nationalists to solve the political crisis, because clearly there was too much strikes going on. And then he was very firm in saying, if you read his very first speech, it's a very austerity speech. I have them at the front page of the let me find it very quickly. This is his speech. The directives, this is his speech in 1922, November 16, 1922. So this is actually like a few weeks after, or 1 week after he comes to power. There's no coup that he's called. That's another thing. Like the myth is there's a coup, there's like a violent break from the democratic capitalist institution. The idea is that no, it's a continuity. And I think that's something that is usually not thought. The directives of domestic policies are summed up in these words: thrift, work, discipline. The financial problem is crucial. The budget has to be balanced as soon as possible. Austerity regime, so you have to use this term. Spending intelligently, the support of the productive forces of the nation, ending all war control and state interferences. So really the urge to back away from the state being the major producer and restabilizing the fundamentals of capitalism. This was his mission and stated, and that's why he got the support of the liberals, both domestically and internationally. So the idea here is that actually Mussolini was able to consolidate his dictatorship because of his capacity to actually do exactly what the experts, the liberal experts were willing to do. So I think this is a story that Polanyi perhaps didn't know, so he generalized on the case of Germany, but I think this is interesting for us again, to kind of shape what we think of what is fascism, fascism is not anti-capitalist. Fascism is actually the best way to preserve wage repression. And the only element of continuity the only element of fascist policies of corporatism in the fascist sense was actually wage repression by law. And all these liberals were saying, in Italy, they can't, competitive market forces don't really work, so we just need the law to do it. And they're fine with that, right? So again, the idea of the state, and this is very Polanyian, the idea of the state not preserving and protecting the market, right? The market is not something natural, but it's something that needs protection. This is exactly what austerity does. So this is very Polanyian in a way.
Okay.
No, great. What pays your point about rising interest rates by the Fed in the United States being used in the context of too many jobs and not enough people to fill them. But I mean, here, I don't know if there's a policy implication of that, but here we have the opposite problem. So we have rising interest rates for various reasons, debts and deficit, etc. But we've actually got one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. How do you explain that in the context of it?
Yeah, thanks. That's really important. So thank you. So two things about this. One is that the case study, of course, is a story that has a time sequence, right? So there's this mobilization, and then there's an explicit counteraction that happens to defeat these labor movements. But I do think that this argument, more than temporal, is structural in the sense that we have to be then sensitive to the different context, right? We can't generalize too much because then that doesn't make sense. But I do think that there's a structural argument that holds even in different historical specificities, which is the fact that ultimately austerity serves to disempower workers. And when unemployment rates are high, that is ultimately the result of the success of austerity having worked in achieving its actual goals, which is ultimately lowering the wage share and increasing the profit rates for many, many years, right? So also in Italy, we're in a similar situation as South Africa in the sense that the unemployment rates are enormous and growth, there's stagnation. Also here I was reading this, there's enormous stagnation, economic stagnation in South Africa as well. And so we are, I think, in a situation in which these are the produced results of austerity, unemployment and economic stagnation. This means that ultimately the goal, the structural purpose of defeating the working class has been achieved. And so in this sense, of course, rising interest rates constantly do the same thing, which is constantly take more resources away from people, right now. And this will further disempower people who are already disempowered, right? So I don't think you need necessarily working class mobility for austerity to rise. So that would be a temporal argument that wouldn't make any sense. I think throughout the history of capitalism, austerity has been deployed in different moments, and in many moments the working class had already been defeated. But this doesn't mean that ultimately these policies continue to shift resources away from these people. And of course, the other thing is that once the Fed hikes the interest rate, we know, especially in countries, that's another reason why it's important to be historically specific. We very well know that the type of dynamics, political economic dynamics that play in the United States are clearly different from the dynamics of countries in the south of the globe, especially when you have such huge levels of debt. So clearly, we see here how an increase in interest rates in the United States has a domino effect on the pressure on other central banks of the world to do the same. And this was also something that was happening, by the way, in the 1920s, in the sense that the United States, I don't talk about, the United States is kind of like an external actor, which is kind of a pity because ultimately they had gained their role as international creditors after the First World War, but the United States were doing austerity also in a moment of upheaval in 1919. They deflated the economy in the 1920s, and the problem with the Brits was that, given that the United States were deflating, they had to deflate even more in order to go up to the gold standard and to avoid their debts skyrocketing, right? So the international consequences of what's happening in other countries as well are invisible there. But to conclude, I think it's important to be historically specific, but I don't think that then what's happening here is against like the general theory if you look at it from a structural point.
Yeah, I just had a small question. I'm a historian, but I didn't read books yet, but I was wondering what the conversation was with Italy's neighboring economists, the Austrians. When Mises writes a book, and it's very clear that in his critique of socialism. I mean, von Hayek, his student. I mean, this is the genealogy of neoliberal thought. Is there kind of conversation going on? Are they influential in these conferences? Because later on there's this Montpellier society that
yes,
formed.
exactly.
But yeah, I thought you'd say something about the Austrians.
The Austrians.
Your neighbors.
Okay, so what can I say? I think the austerity framework can apply they were themselves espousing and justify austerity, and I think the Globalist, the book of Princeton, does a good I don't know if you read it. It's like he tries to trace back the longue durée of neoliberalism to the post-interwar period in the 20s. And is focusing on Vienna and actually has von Mises as one as his. So I think the first chapter of his book actually like shows how von Mises was exactly on the same line. And what I would like to say is I don't recall if they were actually in conversation directly, but Pantaleoni and the Austrians. This I would have to go check. Definitely they were translating. So Pantaleoni was had with Pareto. And this is really, I was joking with you before, but I was just teaching my students last week, and they were all really upset. Like, we've been studying Pareto optimality for the last year, and no one has told us that Pareto was a fascist. I'm like, I was like, yeah, also Gini was a fascist, if you want to know. Like, so it's really interesting. So and they were very shocked. They were like, how do we like use their criteria that ultimately are criteria also for some form of like social justice or like normative criteria to judge our society, and these guys were fascists. But Gini and Pareto was kind of different fascists, because Pareto was more of a Pantaleoni, was a pure economist fascist. So he's like more in line with the Austrians. Already Gini was more of a corporatist. But anyway, the reason why I say this is that they had a journal, Pareto and Pantaleoni, called Giornale degli Economisti, that they bought in 1918, because they realized that they had to expel. There was a historical school was very influential in Italy, and the Marxist school, and they needed to. They played a battle not just against the workers, but also in academia. This is really important, actually, and it's in the story, but less focused than what it could be. They realized that they needed to purchase the most important academic journal, and they needed to make sure that they would start publishing only pure economics. And so in this effort, they were translating various other contributions. And I'm sure I had read all those. Now I can't recall exactly, but I'm sure that they were translating the Austrians as well.
So last small one. So is the famous publisher Einaudi the same Einaudi mentioned?
So Einaudi, by the way, translated my book in Italian. It came out simultaneous. So my now is Luigi Einaudi, who is the father, and then he had his son Giulio Einaudi, who was actually very critical of his father's views and was actually more of a committed communist, and so that it was yeah. So it was not in the same, but yeah, they're in the same family.
Yes, I'm very pleased. As a student of inequality, I feel much better now. Right? Gini was just a corporate, just rather than something else. But my point was really about the state. It seems to me that austerity is something mediated as policy, comes through the state, right? It's an economic policy.
Absolutely.
And so it seems to me that there's a need to think about the state and how it sits between workers and capitalists. That's very important to what you're arguing. We come from a country that has a famous tradition in making Marxist theory rethink the role of the state, like this economic determinism, which goes quite far in terms of explaining the creation of a unlimited supply of labor by destroying the peasantry in the country, for example. But it starts coming apart at the seams. And so Marxist social theory starts talking about racial capitalism to try and come to grips with the state as a complicated mediator of all sorts of interests, sometimes even with its own interests.
Yeah.
Imperialism of a special sort, colonialism of a special kind. So Marxist theory of trying to understand South Africa is you have to grapple with the state. And policy then comes out of a sort of complicated thing that's not just an economic determinist thing. And I'm interested in what you have to say about that, because it strikes me as important, because otherwise it helps me to understand how come sometimes, you know, even Marxists would have some concerns over the fact that you know, there's some consumption issues that are, some people are consuming too much, and that means the masses can't consume at all. You know, but it's not, it's unproductive consumption. And it sits in the middle somewhere, so it doesn't so easily splice into, you know, you guys must just work really hard so that we can keep the accumulation